You're listening to the Rule of Life podcast by Practicing the Way. In each season, we explore an ancient practice from the way of Jesus and its relevance for the modern era. This is Season 4, Solitude. Hi, guys.
Hey,
Welcome to my living room.
Oh, thanks for having us.
so nice to be here.
Great to be with you guys. We were together on Season 1 of
That's
the
right.
Rule of
We were
Life podcast. You started it all.
the OGs.
And so we thought we would get the band back together. You know, the three-piece.
The trio.
Yes.
The trio.
Anybody
Vocals,
can do a
bass,
four-piece.
drums. What are we doing here?
I don't know. Comedic humor, monotone sermons.
Beauty.
Yes. So here we are, back together. For those of you listening, my name is John Mark Comer. I'm here with the lovely Bethany Allen. Bethany, you are the pastor for spiritual formation and leadership development at Bridgetown Church.
I am.
It's a big
Right?
deal.
That's still the title.
Still doing that. Yeah.
And I'm also here with Bryan Rouanzoin. Bryan, you were a pastor until very recently here
Yeah.
in Southern California. But just recently, you and your wife, Jenny, started Roots and Embers, which
That's
is
right.
in, I think, a similar stream to Practicing the Way. You're working with church teams and pastors to cultivate a kind of culture of spiritual formation
Yeah, exactly.
in community, and also with leaders and pastors to transition to the second half of life.
That's exactly right.
We need more of that, man. What a
I know,
first
it's
half of life culture we live in.
Absolutely. It's pretty wild.
So, really grateful that you're here. We are here to explore the practice of solitude. And at Practicing the Way, we're in a 3-year process of developing these 9 practices that together make a rule of life, hence the title of this podcast. And they're all, we chose kind of one-word monikers. But when we talk about solitude, really we're talking about solitude and silence and stillness. And those 3, kind of solitude, silence, stillness, kind of work together and compose one way of being that we see all over the life of Jesus. So really happy to have both of you as conversation partners. Thank you.
Oh, it's
Yeah.
really, we're excited to be here.
It's an honor.
And to all of you listening, thank you for coming wherever you're at, in your car or your morning commute or your bike ride, whatever. Welcome to Season 4.
Yeah, we have some amazing guests lined up
Yeah.
for the coming weeks, starting with the one and only John Ortberg next week.
Come on.
Or this coming week?
The
Next
best.
week. But before we get into those interviews, we thought it would be helpful to interview you, John Mark, and hear a little bit more about the why behind this practice. You know, I think it's a fascinating time to be talking about the practice of solitude, as it really seems to be in many ways disappearing from our world, this discipline.
Or disappeared.
Yeah, disappeared in this it's a noisy world that we're living in.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think this is a fascinating moment and topic to be entering into.
Yeah, I mean, it's not hyperbolic to say, you know, the world is noisier than it's ever been. You know, there's less quiet, less solitude than I think ever in human history. You know, Suzanne Cain in her book Quiet writes about the effect of urbanization, you know, with the Industrial Revolution. And we're not talking that long ago, up until really 100 years ago for sure. Really, some argue until World War II. Most human beings were farmers or were at least in small towns or kind of rural villages. And in that landscape kind of life architecture, solitude was just built into the fabric of your life. You know, it was not like necessarily a practice on your rule of life. It was just kind of Tuesday. You know, if you're a farmer, you're out alone in the field for 10 hours. There's no earbuds, no radio, no, you know. And community was also built in. And it's funny how with urbanization, it's like we've lost both solitude and community. But she writes about the effect of people moving into cities, especially after World War II, and how it created what she calls the extroverted ideal. And her book isn't about solitude, it's about introversion. And solitude is not a discipline for introverts. We'll come back to that. But she writes about how with this new urban culture where all of a sudden now we're surrounded by strangers all of the time, and our new work kind of basically means we have to sell ourselves to other people. Basically, she writes about how now in American culture, you have this extroverted ideal where everybody in public has to act like an extrovert, even if they're introverted.
Wow.
So the world is more extroverted, and that's not bad, but that means it's more noisy and action-oriented and talkative and boisterous. And again, solitude is not a discipline for introverts. It's just the point there is this has been happening for a century. But of course, as we all know, it just went to 11 with the digital age. It's like now the industrial thing was one epochal change in human history. And now we're in another that our generation is living through with the phone. So Cal Newport, in his book, Digital Minimalism, has a beautiful chapter on solitude, not as a spiritual discipline, just as like a wisdom habit. Human need. Yeah. And he has this great line where he writes, "It is now possible to completely banish solitude from your life." Oof. And what he means is now, even when we're alone, we're not in solitude.
Yeah.
Because even when we're not around other people, we're with our device. And so we're texting or we're watching TV or we're doing email or we're Googling whatever, or we're listening to podcasts or music. Like we're alone, but we're not in solitude. And, Johann Hari, I just read his book, Stolen Focus. Brian, did you read that?
It's an amazing book, yeah.
And Bethany, you got to read it. It's like one of my favorite books of the year. And he, there's the stat about how many people sleep next to their smartphone. And that number keeps going up, not down. And so his most recent stat, I think it was 87% of people sleep next to their smartphone. Most people check it first thing upon waking. But he had another stat in there I had not read before. I forget the exact number. I think it was in the 20s. The number of people that actually sleep with their smartphone, like in their hand, in their bed. And it wasn't like 2%. It was much higher. So if you're listening, and that's you, it just, no judgment.
No judgment.
Well, maybe a little bit of judgment, but it's not godly.
A tiny bit.
Yeah.
But an invitation.
My point is, that's the world we're living in, where people are literally sleeping with their phone in their hand. So all that to say, the need for solitude, as we'll explore, goes all the way back to the life of Jesus. It's a human need, but it is exacerbated to the nth degree by the world we're living in.
Okay, well, I say we just jump in. So I want to start with this question. I want to know why this is important. You reflected some of that in what you've just shared and these startling numbers you've shared with us. But just as we start, why is this important for us?
Well, I start from the premise that we are apprentices of Jesus. And if you're listening, you're either on that spiritual journey or at least interested in it. And solitude and silence and stillness are all over the life of Jesus. So the first story pretty much you read about Jesus' work as an adult is about, after his baptism, Jesus going into the wilderness for 40 days. That word wilderness is eremos in Greek, and wilderness is actually a really good translation. Sometimes it's translated the desert, but it doesn't necessarily mean like no trees and all sand or the Sahara or whatever. It's also translated the deserted place. Other translations are the solitary place or the lonely place, or one of my favorites is the quiet place. And Jesus goes away out into the wilderness where it's quiet, away from all people for 40 days. And then he comes back. And then all through the Gospels, you just see Jesus disappear back there to the eremos. And that word is used. It's translated different ways in our English versions of the Bible, but it's used all over the four Gospels. Not for 40 days again, but like in Mark's telling of the story, I love it. Jesus goes away for 40 days into the eremos, comes back. Then Mark 1 has this like marathon kind of Jesus' first day on the job as Messiah. And it's, he's healing people until late at night after the Sabbath. And then, at the end of Mark 1, there's this fascinating paragraph where Mark writes, then early in the morning, Jesus got up, went out to, in English, it's a solitary place, but in Greek, it's eremos. It's the same word. He goes back to the wilderness, goes out to the solitary place where he prayed. And he's there for not 40 days, but he's there for like half a day or something. And they literally put a search party out for him. Where are you? And I just think that's so interesting. Like if I'm Jesus and I have this marathon day, I'm thinking the next morning I sleep in, a little pour over.
I was going to say.
The privileged side.
Brunch with James and John, not the other ones, they're a little tiring, but James and John, maybe a matinee.
The besties.
I don't know. Some social media, I don't know, but literally it goes away for 40 days, comes back in Mark's kind of literary design, one day goes back again. And so this is just all over the life of Jesus. Luke has this summary. This is Luke 5, verse 16. Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. Lonely places, again, that's eremos in Greek. So you just see this all over the life of Jesus. And then if you read church history, pretty much all of the saints, sages from every century, every era, every stream of the church, pretty much except for evangelicalism, but even then, we have quiet place, quiet time kind of tradition. They all basically sing in chorus that solitude and silence are, if not the foundation of the spiritual life, that might be an overstatement, but they are foundational
Yeah.
Yes.
to the spiritual life. I mean, I can't say it this bluntly because I'm not Henry Nouwen, but Henry Nouwen is Henry Nouwen. And I love this line. I quote it whenever I teach on solitude. Without solitude, it is virtually impossible to live a spiritual life. Just let that sink in. Without this, it is virtually impossible to live a spiritual life. We do not take the spiritual life seriously if we do not set aside some time to be with God and listen to him. And I think, evangelicals love to talk about a personal relationship with Jesus, or recent kind of language is intimacy with God. And I actually love that language. But, I just think about my own marriage. Can you imagine like a healthy marriage where you were never alone together? Ever? You were always with other people, or always in public, or always around noise. I think anybody would say, no, you literally can't have an intimate, healthy relationship if you're never alone. And the same is true on the community side. You can't have a healthy relationship if you're always alone, And so it's a back and forth that you see in the life of Jesus. But I think a lot of people are trying to find an intimate relationship with God without ever going into solitude.
Yes.
And it just doesn't work. You just cannot, it cannot be done. And so people live with this sense of felt distance from God. And I'm not saying solitude is some rubber bullet, silver bullet solution where you just go into solitude and now you're good. But man, you cannot experience it without. Mother Teresa, who's just so beautiful on this, has that line, we need to find God, and he cannot be found in noise and restlessness. God is the friend of silence.
I love that language of friendship, even what you're talking about with the intimacy between you and your partner, and the solitude creates that space, the personal time. But I think what I'm hearing is there's a distinction that you're making between being alone and being in solitude. Say more about that.
Absolutely. Thank you for pointing that out. It's crucial. So I had help when this podcast is companion to a 4-week solitude practice that has just come out. And I had help from these research professors, and I asked them, hey, can you just teach me more about a few things? I wanted to learn about noise pollution and its effect on the nervous system and the body. I wanted to learn about just a couple of things. And one thing I found really interesting was that when social scientists study solitude, they have to distinguish between solitude and aloneness. So if you're a secular social scientist, you're a research professor, solitude is not aloneness. You have to separate them because of what we said before. Like you can be alone, but you're not really alone. You're on your phone. Your brain is full of distraction, So Cal Newport, again, he defines solitude as a place that is free of all inputs. So that's a really interesting rubric to think about it through, where your only inputs are God, who has direct access to your mind and imagination, your heart, your body by the Holy Spirit, if you're a follower of Jesus, and your own heart, just whatever's coming up from within you.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's solitude, where you are there with God, with your own self, and no other inputs. But lots of people are alone and their mind is jammed with other inputs through their device or the internet or a book or even scripture, which is beautiful. We're very much for scripture. But I think this is really important because what I think a lot of people get wrong is they think of solitude as a spiritual discipline for introverts. And this is a tragedy for extroverts because they never experience this whole crucial dimension of Christian spirituality, this foundational practice. And it's a tragedy for us introverts too, because, the enemy, both the evil one and our own broken body and flesh, is always warping. We're always living in orbital decay, right, from God's intention. And I think what happens with solitude is we might start out like, hey, I really want to go into solitude to encounter God. But it's just for us introverts, it so easily becomes like a little me time for dad. Like I have teenagers and it's stressful on my job and I live in a city and I just, I need some time, That's not like the spirit. That's just my introversion. It's my personality preference. And that's tragic because all of the spiritual disciplines are a means to an end. The end is to become a person of love, which is self-sacrifice and surrender. So there's a type of solitude that does nothing but deepen our bondage to narcissism.
Yeah.
When really we should not be in solitude. We should be making breakfast for our kids before they go to school, not having 4-hour devotions, So this is a great tragedy. Solitude is not aloneness. And when social scientists study solitude and they distinguish it from aloneness, this was fascinating to me. They find that there is no more preference for, desire for, or enjoyment of solitude, whether you're an introvert or an extrovert. So once you separate it from we introverts, we love to be alone.
Totally.
Like just give me a night by myself. Let me just go read a novel, do some poetry.
Hey, I'm a compulsive extrovert and I still need to be alone.
It's done.
Yeah.
I'm a compulsive introvert and I always want to be alone. but once you I want that. But once you actually put people into solitude, no other inputs, just you before God, it does not matter. You do not, your enjoyment of it, your desire for this practice has nothing to do with where you fall on the introvert-extrovert spectrum. Again, this is social science, not my opinion.
Yeah.
It has to do with where you fall on the spiritual journey.
Wow.
And where you are and how you are experiencing God.
Wow.
It's like a level playing field.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So I love that idea, Cal Newport's idea of it being a place free from inputs. And even that sociological study that you're talking about is really significant. But what's your working definition of solitude?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have like a brilliant one. I just, Bethany, when we did that teaching series on it years ago, I think we just used the definition of intentional time in the quiet to be with yourself and God. And those are the two inputs. Yourself, meaning, and I think we'll explore that with you, Bethany, in a few weeks, but what's coming up inside you from, your heart in biblical language, and God. And this, again, is different than how a lot of us think of solitude as like, I'm going to go be alone and read a bunch of Christian books or whatever. So
more input.
More input.
Yeah.
And again, I'm very much for Christian books. I write Christian books. But, my practice of solitude changed a lot about 2 years ago. I did this 21-day solitude retreat.
I remember that.
And it was like I thought I would crush it. I'm like, man, I do a lot of solitude. I spend a lot of time in solitude. I do a monthly retreat for a day. I do an annual retreat. I'm an introvert. I thought, man, there's no grade at the end of it, but I'm like,
you're going to get an A.
I'm going to win.
Solid.
I'm summa cum laude for this solitude retreat. And it was harrowing. I mean, I barely survived this thing. And it was guided with a clinical psychologist. But, they had a bunch of rules. So it was like, no phone, like you literally turn in your devices. No alcohol, no more than 1 cup of coffee a day. But one of the rules was...
that might be the hardest.
Yes, that was brutal. But one of the rules was no books. And even like the Bible was, quote, allowed. And they're not against the Bible, but they said, be careful not to use it as a distraction.
Yeah.
And when I first heard that, I was like, what are you even talking about?
Yeah.
And I asked him, the clinical psychologist who kind of oversees the program, why no books? Like normally in solitude, I do spiritual reading. I love reading. It's a big part of my life with Jesus. And he had this great line. He said, this is our attempt to recreate the experience of Jesus in the desert, or Moses in the desert, or Elijah, or pretty much all of the great ones in the desert. And he said, the desert teaches by taking away. And I've just been thinking about that. We're used to learning by addition. Like, here's a book, here's a podcast. Let us give you new information about the practice of solitude or whatever. A sermon, a book, a podcast, a class, a course. And that's all good. That's actually crucial. But the desert teaches by stripping away. And think about the desert itself, like the literal desert. Where it's just barren and you hear things for a mile because sound travels so far in the desert, and you notice minute detail that you would never catch in the fecundancy of a Pacific Northwest forest, And so that's what solitude is. It's stripping yourself down of all other inputs and going into the eremos to be with yourself and with God.
Mm.
You know, even as you're speaking, you're helping me come to realize that I think when I was young and starting to practice this in my 20s, my biggest escaping of solitude was people. Like it
Mm-hmm.
just was so, as an extrovert, it's the easiest way to avoid the confrontation of self, everything that you're talking about. But as I've gotten older, as life has changed,
You're saying people became in a sense like your coping mechanism
yeah, oh yeah. Well,
for the
just
stuff that you're running
I
away
had
from.
so many things.
Yes.
Yeah. And even, I wouldn't have named it that then. But as I've gotten older and as life changed, young kids, all the things, it's 100% information that is my biggest obstacle to genuine solitude.
Wow.
And as
Meaning when you have a down moment.
yeah, oh yeah, it's podcast, it's audiobook, it's reading, it's the Bible, it's something that, because even if there's distance and quiet in myself, if there's distance from other things, there is still something that feels this nagging sense of efficiency
Yes.
or pragmatism,
Mm-hmm.
as well as avoidance.
I feel
I
like
think
you're
probably
doing something.
yeah, because it's so
Because
contrary.
solitude is like a not doing.
It is.
It's a
yeah.
discipline of abstinence, as we
Yeah,
have
it's
called it.
so difficult. But as you said, for all those reasons, all the noise, all the demands, and it just is the opposite. It's like social inertia. It's like you're going so fast, you don't
Yeah.
want to slow down. The hardest thing is actually go to the opposite. It's kind of coming out of vacation. You've
Yes.
slowed down so much, it's
Mhm.
hard to get back up to it. And I feel like that's the challenge that you named. That 21-day retreat sounds wild.
Yeah.
But thank you for sharing.
Do not try this at home.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
great. Put that tagline, caution. But I think what's interesting is you just named solitude so well, but we're also including these other things. And I know it's not easy to separate them necessarily. But what about stillness and what about silence and how that plays into the solitude conversation?
Yeah, I mean, again, solitude it's tied, it's in tandem to silence. And I
Yeah.
think when we talk about the practice or the spiritual discipline of solitude and silence, there are two dimensions to silence. One is the external silence, like you want to get your body and your nervous system away from noise.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there's a helpful just, clarification here. Because when you go out, for example, into nature, which is where Jesus did all of his solitude, it was not in a sensory deprivation chamber.
Yeah.
It was like out in Judea or the Negev. There's actually sound. There's birds and there's
Yeah.
wind and there's trees and there's, rocks and the wind. And so noise, social scientists define as unwanted sound.
Yeah.
So music
That's
is not noise, unless if it's like Metallica and you're me, then it's noise. But whatever. For other people, that's music. So noise is unwanted sound. It's the Amazon delivery truck blaring past you when you're,
Wow.
drinking your coffee in the morning or whatever. So silence is about, external silence is about quieting that noise, basically getting yourself to a spot that is literally quiet. So a lot of times people want to allegorize
Yeah.
silence and
Yeah.
solitude. Like, yeah, I totally did silence and solitude at the coffee shop the other day. I just put in my noise canceling headphones and I put on that new record by Lainey and I just like read a great book and it was just amazing time of silence and solitude. And I'm like, or people want to like, so you can be in a crowd and be in solitude, like just you and God as you're walking through Manhattan. I'm just like, no, that is such non-incarnational thinking.
Yeah.
And I love the heart behind that, but we are incarnated, we are embodied, we have a nervous system, we have a brain, we have senses that interact with the world around us. And so this is an embodied, is why we don't call them spiritual disciplines, because that word, it's not bad language, but it's not New Testament language. And most people think spiritual means like disembodied, which is not what it means in the New Testament, but it is what it means in pop language. So that these are embodied practices.
Yeah.
So I think the first dimension of silence is just getting somewhere quiet. And then the second dimension that is 10 times harder for most of us is like interior silence.
Yeah.
Where you attempt to quiet the brain. I mean, that's the problem, is like an hour in silence may be the noisiest hour of your life.
Yeah.
Because your brain just does not turn off. And often it takes that chance to just like freak out and scream. And whether it's like fear or anger or resentment, stuff that we'll talk about soon, or just like squirrel, you know what I mean? Just like distraction.
To-do list.
So getting to a place of inner quiet. And that's
Mm.
why, you could just call it solitude and silence. I like to put together solitude and stillness.
Yeah.
And stillness is like coming, I think of this place we go camping every summer in Eastern Oregon that's on this lake. It's this kind of really not very large lake, but this beautiful place. Nobody's ever there. And just that feeling when you wake up in the morning and the
Mm.
lake is just like glass. And then by the end of the day, the wind picks up and it's just
Yeah.
agitated and it's choppy. But in the morning, like that, there's nothing like a lake that's just
Mm.
smooth, And I think that's a good word picture for what the place that we're wanting to come to, and honestly, rarely get to in my own practice of this. But that's like the telos coming
Yeah.
Yeah.
coming to that place of stillness. Bethany, remember when we did that series on it? I went up to a creek in Forest Park, and I filled up like a
Yep.
mason jar kind of thing, glass jar of just creek water.
Yep.
And I just set it on the stage when I was teaching on this, and I just shook it up and just set it there. And you just watch,
Yeah.
because all the sediment, it's swirling, it's
Totally.
muddy, it's dirty, it's
Yeah.
green.
Yep.
And then it takes a long time. It's like
Yeah.
A
toward the
long
end of
time.
like a 45-minute
Yep.
teaching, you get this thing where all the sediment has fallen to the bottom and the whole rest of the top is clear
Yeah.
and still.
Yeah.
And I think that, again, is a word picture for what we're wanting to see happen on the inside
Yeah.
and in our mind when we go into solitude.
It's almost like a byproduct of the posturing of the other two.
Yeah.
It's the outcome internally rather than the practice. It's almost like you're saying you can't practice stillness. It's almost a byproduct of the other two. And
Yes.
they come together in tangent. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good way. That's helpful insight. Yes, there to get us there. And then stillness
Yeah.
is still a means to an end.
Yes.
I think it's in that place of stillness that we are most capable of receiving God's voice
Yeah.
Yeah.
and
Yes.
God's work in our inner woman or man.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The more agitated we are, the more distracted we
Yes.
are, the more hurried we are, the less our spirit is able to absorb
Yeah.
both God's speaking voice, but also really the intimations of his spirit, and
Yeah.
really, I mean, that's one way. I was reading Father Jacques Philippe yesterday, and he basically said the foundational question of Christian discipleship is, how do I make myself more available to the work
Yeah.
of grace?
Yeah.
Like, that's what the practices are all about. What
That's
do I
it.
need to do with my body, with my money, with my time, with my
Yeah.
decisions, with my habits? How do I open up more and more layers of my life to grace? Because we don't self-save,
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
that's where the goal of stillness is not to like feel nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nothing wrong with feeling less anxiety and more peace. That's great.
Yeah.
But the goal is to make ourselves available to God, to his
Yeah.
voice, to his work, because at the end of the day, salvation is his work, not ours. I can turn off
Yeah.
my phone and go spend an hour in prayer, but I can't even bring myself to stillness, much less save myself.
Yeah.
Yeah. It feels like that moment or that place is where the things that we know consciously, I am the beloved, all the things that we might tell ourselves, we know we can ascribe to. It's almost like they have this magnifying place in that stillness. It's like that openness just opens up, and what we know that we know actually becomes what we experience that we know in that
Yes.
stillness. And I love that language in the Psalms.
You're saying you're moved from the idea of
Yeah.
spirituality
It's like
to
until
the
you have that-
experience.
what you just defined in that moment of stillness is like where those things become real to us.
Yes.
Not just hopes or ideals and things that we capture throughout the day, but we don't really, it's like that, they anchor more deeply. And I love that image of stillness.
Just the Ephesians, like that you may know
Yes.
the love of Christ
Yes.
that passes knowledge.
Well, I was thinking, and correct me, my Hebrew is not great, but Rafa.
I will not correct you.
Rafa,
I will. So
be
stay
still,
tuned.
like be still and know that I'm God. The word means to sink down. So there's something about that, like coming to a deeper place than we can normally. And that's the place of the Holy
Wow.
Spirit, what you're talking about. Whereas like that's where friendship can emerge and doesn't live on the surface. It lives deeply within us.
It's like that old Quaker saying, centering down.
Yes. Oh, I love that.
That's what prayer is about for them. They said it's about centering
Yeah.
down. And that was their language for
Yeah.
exactly what you're saying.
Yeah.
Coming like to the base of your soul, to
Yeah.
that place of stillness,
Yeah.
And I love that your you're holding your eyes on that. Like, this is about, can we come to know his love? Can we take more of his love in and be in union with him?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nothing else.
Yeah, I mean, like the Hollywood trope of like, inner peace.
Yeah, yeah.
And like the martial arts master or the
Yeah.
person on top of the mountain.
Yeah.
That there's truth in that.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
But in Christian spirituality, again, it's not just to feel better,
Yeah.
and it's to really come to this place of what ancients would have called union with God.
Yeah.
But I love what you're saying. It's like the difference between. I was with Ron Rolheiser recently, and he was talking about
big
the
deal.
difference between. He's an academic, but the discipline of. You were there too. Yes,
Yeah.
we were there together. I loved his thing on the difference between theology and spirituality.
Oh, it's a great
And
distinction.
his analogy was like in sports. He's like, theology is help me here, but he's
Yeah.
like, theology is the rules of the
That's it.
game.
Yep.
So like when we talk about theology, biblical doctrine, these are the rules of the game. It's
Yeah.
how you play the game. But spirituality is
Yeah.
the game itself.
Yeah.
And so both are important. You can't play the game
Yeah.
without the game rules,
I can't remember if it was him that said that, but I love the maybe the same conversation where he said that theology sets the expectations, but it will not fulfill them.
Yeah.
Like, it sets our expectations for life with God, but it cannot fulfill that life with God.
Mm.
And that is like such a just rich importance. Like, we need both.
Yeah, I mean, I'm learning a lot, and because people listen to this podcast from a wide swath of the church,
Yeah.
you discover like, oh, there are trigger words I don't know about,
Mm.
And so one word I've found that is emotionally loaded for a lot of people is this word mystic.
Mm.
And because I think of mysticism as
Yeah.
like central to Christian
Yeah,
spirituality.
absolutely.
But I think what I mean by that is not what people fear.
Yeah.
Carl Rayner had that great line a few decades ago. He said, "The Christian of the future will be a mystic, or they will not exist at all."
Yeah.
But what we mean by mystic is not some weird, hetero-orthodox thing. A mystic in the Christian tradition is just someone who wants to experience spiritually what is true of them theologically.
That's a great
So
definition.
it's
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
enough
Wow.
to read the New Testament, read Paul, and like read a systematic theology of the doctrine of incorporation, which is the academic word for Paul's theology of in Christ. You are in Christ. Your life is hidden with Christ in God. Colossians. The mystery of the mystery of the gospel.
Yeah.
That's a beautiful idea, but there's an inner mystic in the good sense of that word where, man, we want to actually live that reality,
Yeah.
not just like read about it or
Yeah.
hear about it, but experience it. And I think this is central because if the telos is to become a person of love, as a general rule, and you're better versed in psychology than I am, Bryan, but we become more loving by experiencing love,
Yeah.
not by learning about it.
Yeah.
So like we are loving at some level to the degree that we have been
Yeah.
loved.
Yeah, we are loved into loving, as my friend Todd will say. I just love that. That's
Yeah.
the more we consume of God's love, the more loving becomes a part of who we are.
I just want to name this one part of this because even as you two are talking, I keep thinking about the posture of stillness is the opening to receive it. We're talking about experiencing it, but when you get to that place of stillness, it's going back to this concept of love is you're actually free to receive what's being given at that point, but you're not as you're moving in that direction. So it's experiential, but it's also because you cannot generate it yourself.
Yeah.
You have to receive it.
I mean, that's, I think, one of the things that's so humbling about it.
Yes.
And hard is like, you're not in control.
Yeah.
You may go into solitude and have a life-changing encounter with God. You may go and just hear crickets and feel farther away from God than when you started. There's no like formula here.
Yeah.
It's not like habit stacking your way to spiritual
Yes,
life.
Right.
that's so good. That's a
I'm
great
all for habit
reminder.
stacking, but that's not how the spiritual disciplines work. James
Yeah.
Clear was great.
Yeah.
I love his book, but that's
Yeah.
not how this works. And I mean, I could not. You're stripped. You
Yeah.
come in
Yeah.
your spiritual poverty, and just okay, God, here I am.
Yeah.
And how you actually are is exposed. But that's why I think the two greatest conduits for experiencing the love of God are deep relationships with other people,
Yeah.
which is where we get wounded, but
Yep.
it's also where we experience love, and solitude.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But solitude, it can't just be I go for a lone day and I read a bunch of books.
Yeah.
You have to like actually sit there
Yeah.
and let the Holy Spirit pour the love of Christ
Yes.
from the Father into the depth of your being.
Mm.
and be
Wow.
transformed.
Yeah.
Okay, so people listening, there's no way that they could hear what you just shared and not think this practice feels like one of the most important practices we could do on our journey with Jesus. If this is the place where true transformation can happen, Jesus coming to us, undoing in us what we couldn't do for ourselves, sounds like a pretty big deal. So is that true for you? Would you say this is one of the most important of all the practices that we could lean into?
Yeah, oh, yes. I mean, certainly. And, I mean, yes, sometimes I think, there are different ways to categorize the practices of Jesus.
Yeah.
So we have them in 9, Adele Calhoun with 69 or something like that, and so it's just a matter of like, how do you
How do you
cut the
break them
pie?
down?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you could argue there's just 2 practices,
Yeah.
solitude and community.
Yeah.
Because in a sense, those 2 practices are like the containers
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
all of the other. I mean, name Sabbath to
Yeah.
worship,
Right.
to the Lord's Supper, to
Right.
scripture,
Yeah.
pretty much to service, they pretty much all happen either in solitude or in community.
Yeah.
And I think these are just the 2 most important practices, because without them, it's like I've been back to the marriage analogy. Imagine if you were never alone together or always alone together. Either way would be really toxic.
Mm-hmm.
We have this need for both solitude and for community. The crazy thing, Sherry Turkle of MIT has that beautiful phrase about Gen Z and which is all of us now in the digital age, alone together.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
How in the modern world, it's like we never really go into community or solitude. We're never really alone, and we're never really in community. We're around people all the time. We're online all the time, which has this like illusion, that connectivity is the same thing as community, which it is absolutely not. The more time you spend on social media, the less in community you are, just as a general stat.
Yeah.
And so we're often like with other people, but we're not really vulnerable. We're on our phone, we're distracted, we're on our guard, we have defense mechanisms, we don't know how to be emotionally vulnerable with people. Or we're alone, but we're not in solitude. We're on our phone, we're, distracting ourselves into spiritual oblivion, as Rolheiser says. So yes, that's a long way of saying, Bethany, I absolutely think it's essential.
Yeah.
Well, then we're making a pretty compelling case, like you just said.
Yeah.
But then why do so many of us, even with all the statistics and understanding, those who've read books on it, why do so many of us avoid solitude as a practice?
What comes to mind? My oldest son, Jude, he's 17, but I don't know, a year ago or so, we were on a camping trip. It was like a man night around the fire thing.
It's a man
night. I had to say it like that. So part of this thing we do called the Primal Path. And we like to do, even with our family, we're going to have Sabbath dinner after this tonight. We'll do it tonight. We like to do like a table question, like to have a more meaningful conversation around the table. So our question that night, I think it was around the fire, was, what do you most fear? So we go around, we're hearing, people's deepest fears, which is an interesting conversation. Gets to my son, and he's quiet for a minute, and he says, my deepest fear is solitude and silence.
Wow.
Mm.
And then he said, I am terrified of being alone with my thoughts.
Mm.
And then he was self-aware enough to say, that's why I always have music on. He's a musician, he loves music. He's like, that's why I always have music on. I'm always with people. And he's like, people think I'm just an extrovert and I love music, and I am. But he's like, I'm terrified.
Mm.
And I really appreciated his insight and honesty. I think that's how a lot of people feel. Again, regardless of where they fall on the introvert-extrovert spectrum.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And, we built this practice. There's 4 weeks to the practice. So week 1's kind of an intro to the practice and the eremos and the life of Jesus. But then the next 3 weeks, we built around, I was really impacted by Nouwen's quote in his book, The Way of the Heart, which is like,
The best.
I think
The
my favorite
best.
Nouwen book.
Yeah.
It's short. If you've not read it, it's not long. It's beautifully written. It's kind of a translation of the desert tradition for the modern era. It's beautiful. But he has this beautiful line in his chapter on solitude where he writes, and I was really convicted by this as an introvert. He writes, solitude is not a private therapeutic place.
Yeah.
And then he goes on, it is the place of encounter
Yeah.
Yeah.
where the old self dies and the new self is born.
Yeah.
So I just thought about that, again, introvert, I was convicted by that. Orbital decay, I quickly turned solitude into like dad's alone time, which is
Yeah.
not the spiritual discipline, not becoming a person of love that way. And, but so we kind of built the practice around these 3 encounters that you experience often in solitude: an encounter with ourselves.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And what we mean by that is like kind of our emotional life, which is often actually it's the negative emotions,
Yeah.
I don't mean that, but you're a psychologist listening, you're like, there are no negative emotions. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The ones that are not pleasant.
Survival emotions.
Yeah, survival
Yeah,
emotions.
whatever.
I know they're all useful and all helpful, but the negative ones, the ones that are unpleasant, often are the first thing to come up. So we'll talk about that with Bethany in 2 weeks. But also an encounter with our enemies, and we'll explore this later, like very counterintuitive for a modern Christian, but for Jesus, for the Desert Fathers, for much of Celtic spirituality, you go into the desert or you go into the quiet place to fight demonic beings
Yeah.
and to get free of demonic voices in your head and to
Yeah.
expose them and overcome demonic evil. Whole dimension of this practice
So
that's like
good.
off the radar for most modern people.
Yeah.
And then finally an encounter with God.
Yeah.
And that's the one that is most intuitive. Like, yes, I go into the quiet to encounter God.
Yeah.
But what we often, I think, intuit at a subconscious level is when I go out there, God's probably not going to be the only thing I encounter.
Mm-hmm.
Probably going to encounter my anger at my dad, or my
Right.
hurt feelings over what happened with a coworker 3 days
Yeah.
ago, or this incredible shame I feel over my past or my body or
Yeah.
my history or whatever. And all of this stuff comes up, and that's beautiful. We'll talk about how crucial this is to our
Yeah.
healing. But I think that's why we avoid it, Not to mention it's just really hard to ever be alone.
Yeah.
It's just hard.
Modern life is
and
designed.
yes, modern life is
Yeah,
designed to make
totally.
it hard for you to be in the
Yeah.
quiet. But even if we all of a sudden were single or Amish or a monk and we're out living in the middle of nowhere, I think we would still find it
Yes.
scary, and we'd still be using distraction, work, busyness, something.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think there's some deep primal fear. But what we most fear, I think, holds the secret to our healing and our liberation.
Yes.
I think I love Mulholland has that idea of postures. And his great invitation is that the entire premise of solitude is actually, it's about getting rid of the control that you carry into
Yes.
everything, the grasping, clawing, protective mechanisms that we all have.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I don't
You have none of those.
Not, especially not with my personality. Not at all.
And but then he says, and then once that has given up, silence, he would say the posture of silence is actually confronting, or maybe it's inverse, but is confronting the real self. And he
Yes.
uses that image of Jacob, where Jacob has none of his things, none of his family, and he has his brother on the other side of the river. And he would not confront, he could not come to the place where he says, I am the heel grabber, if he were not alone in that space, away from all of the ways that he managed and protected himself. And that image has been really crucial because it's been a part of my own story of like
the image of Jacob wrestling.
Yeah, the wrestling with God, right?
Yes.
But in that, the discovery of the real self. The first time he names who he really is in that wrestling.
Wow.
Because the first time he says his name, he says he's his brother.
Mm-hmm.
And then the first time he says who he really is at the core level, I am the heel grasper, is when he is finally alone with none of his capacity to protect himself.
All his props.
All of his props.
Yeah.
That's a great word for
It's
it.
funny.
Yeah.
There's
Scaffolding.
it's counterintuitive, but there's such similarity between community and solitude.
Yes.
And I don't mean community like in
No.
a crowd. I mean like
Yeah.
real, where you, and I
Intimacy.
think what they share is you can't hide.
Yeah.
When you're in really close
Yeah.
relationships, when you actually feel safe and your
Yeah.
nervous system lets down its guard, like the real you comes out. It's why we're
Yeah.
all like, I treat my wife and my children worse than anybody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that sounds so heinous.
Yeah.
But it's because I feel safe with them. I
Yeah.
don't question their love. I don't
Yeah.
feel that I'm going to be abandoned by
Yeah.
them or left by them.
Yeah.
So I can be nice to people all day
Yeah.
long and then walk in after a work day and just
Yeah.
immediately snap at my
Absolutely.
kid or be rude and ungrateful to my wife. And that's like all of
Mm.
that is in me.
Yeah.
But, I can hide it in social settings. I
Yeah.
can make myself look better than I really am.
Yeah.
You cannot hide
Yeah.
in close relationships, and you cannot hide in solitude.
Mm.
And that is a gift. Terrifying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it is a gift.
Yeah.
Mm.
Okay, so we've talked about really broad sweeping,
Yeah.
brilliant ideas. I want to bring it down just to the practical.
Yeah, this is not a theory, it's a practice.
Yeah, I mean, and so much of this is an deeply integrated practice. So for those of us who are just trying to sort this out in our head, we're just trying to get it at a ground level. What's a way to begin?
Yeah.
Just to even enter in, to start moving towards this. Where do we start?
Yeah, I mean, we all have a different starting place. You may already have this practice in your life, and so for you, as you're listening, it's like, okay, what's the growth edge for you?
Yeah.
Or this may be like, I think most modern people, like pretty much non-existent in your life. And so if you're on the kind of, man, this is not a part of my life, I just think just as a general rule with spiritual practices, start small. You know, the tiny habits idea. Start, do not overreach.
Yeah.
Just have a real spiritual realism about you. And so don't go do a 21-day solitude retreat if you've never been
into
alone.
a marathon.
Yeah,
deep plunge.
Yes, exactly. That is exactly. It's going from I've never run to the marathon. You know. So just just start. Change the morning arrangement. If you're part of the 87% of people that sleep next to their phone, again, this is just wisdom. This is not, I think it's wisdom. It's definitely not biblical imperative, but I would highly encourage you, buy an old school alarm clock or find one from back in the day that's in your closet somewhere. Put your phone away in another room, parent your phone, put it, just like if you had little kids, put it to bed before you go to bed so you have some space, and then wake up to an alarm clock. And before you touch your phone, whether this is an hour or 3 minutes, just sit in the quiet with God. Whether you just breathe, or I like to breathe and I always read a psalm. The Psalms are basically my lectionary. They're how I pray. They're my pathway to God most days. And just whether it's for a few minutes, whether you sit and breathe for a bit, or you pray out loud to God, or you read scripture, or just pause. You know, Bryan, I remember you saying to me, you know, as you have little kids, sometimes, you know, you wake up to a baby crying and you're not going to have an hour of like contemplation and reading Henry Nouwen. That's not how your day is going to start. It's going to start with feeding and, you know, and I remember you saying that sometimes you just, as the baby's crying, you just recite with your head still on the pillow, Psalm 23 in your mind. And you let that be your beginning, you know? So that might be the beginning for you. Just, you know, it's such a simple, beautiful, easy. So again, the morning might not be the best time for you with your personality or your chronotype or your work schedule. That's a thing.
I know.
Great. So do it at night before bed, or do it on your lunch break, whatever. You know, wherever is the best place for you. For most people, the best place to move towards stillness is first thing in the morning after sleeping. But it might not be. And neuroscientists talk a lot about the importance of what we do with our mind right before we sleep and right after we sleep. Disproportionate impact on your, not just mental health, but on the neuroplasticity of your brain's development, the kind of mind that you develop over time. Could not imagine a better way to deform your mind than to begin your day with like the site formerly known as Twitter and the news and social media and email and, you know, and Psalm 23 and the presence of peace of God is a beautiful place to begin. For those of you that are interested in doing more, again, we do have this practice out that goes week by week with all sorts of pragmatic, like
it's a great invitation.
all sorts of stuff,
Really
writing,
helpful.
teaching, it's a practice. It's there for you.
Okay. Well, thank you for listening. And thank you in particular to the Circle for your generosity, which made this podcast even possible. The Circle is a group of over 1,000 people from around the world who give monthly to Practicing the Way to see formation integrated into the church at large. It's amazing. Wow. Thank you. Now, we'll be back next week with a conversation with John Ortberg. And in the meantime, we're a new podcast, so please help spread the word to your friends and family. And may you find God in both the noise of your daily life, but also in the quiet.